Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another one of our History 11 lectures with me, your instructor, Vernon Creviston. This lecture, we're going to kind of pick up where we left off, speaking about what happens after the colonies kind of respond to this growing confrontation they're having with their own government, the British government, here in 1776. Remember, up to this point, it has been about resistance, but in 1774, after the events of the Boston Tea Party, and especially the British response to that with the coercive, or what are called in the colonies the Intolerable Acts, the confrontation has ratcheted up. It's no longer about resisting, about protests. It's shooting and killing of people. The British Army tries to head off any possibility of a rebellion by going out and seizing weapons in Massachusetts, and it actually just leads to further confrontation. Soon there's actual battles being fought between colonists and the British government, like at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and the British Army in Boston essentially finds itself under siege. So a lot has changed in a relatively small period of time. Remember, in 1770 at the Boston Massacre, that could have been a flashpoint that led to all this, but it didn't. There was still this idea of negotiation. There was still this idea that both sides could make the other side kind of listen and kind of change its opinion, right? Change its policies. But by 1775, that's kind of thrown out of the window. And late in 1775 comes the big game changer, and that, of course, is Thomas Paine's Common Sense, where he just tells American colonists, look, it makes no sense being a part of the British Empire anymore. You're going to be bigger, you're going to be more powerful, you can really kind of create your own economy now. You don't need the British government any longer. And Paine kind of encapsulates this feeling that's starting to really kind of permeate the American colonies. At least a third of the American colonists kind of agree with Paine almost initially. And in some places, it might be as high as 50% of the colonists kind of saying, yes, we should be independent. We should be our own states. A big thing to kind of keep in mind here. Now, we're not talking about one united country yet. We're talking about these individual colonies deciding for themselves to become individual states, that they're going to run their own affairs, that they're no longer have to listen to the British government, especially Parliament. That's who they see as the one being the problem. But that brings us back to a very, very important part of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. As he points out to colonists, it's not just Parliament that you have a problem with. You also have a problem with the British king. He's not doing his job. Remember, since the Magna Carta, there's been this idea growing, evolving in English, now British politics, that you want to kind of have checks and balances here, that you want to have separation of powers to keep down the level of corruption, to keep down the abuse of power by one agent or the other. And in recent English-British history, they'd actually seen this happen, right? Charles I tried to put too much power in the king's hands. In response to Charles I's execution, Parliament took too much power in its hands. So the people of Britain really wanted a system where there was this system of checks and balances. And they hope to find that in their system that they create after that glorious revolution in 1688, when they deposed the younger son of Charles I, James II. And they kind of get it to work, right? New British kings and queens agree that they will follow the rules, that they will share power with Parliament. And Thomas Paine's pointing that out in Common Sense. He says, look, if Parliament's getting to do this stuff and the king's not stopping them, that means the king agrees with them and he's going to support Parliament against you, the American colonists. And a lot of American colonists are coming to that same realization. Up until this point in 1776, American colonists have been writing letters. The First Continental Congress wrote letters to the king saying, please help us, stop Parliament from doing these things. Over and over again, individual colonial assemblies had written the king saying, please stop these abuses by Parliament. And nothing was being done. The king didn't respond to them. So now Thomas Paine's saying that essentially means the king is on Parliament's side. He's against you. And it opens up this discussion of whether we should actually renounce our participation in the British Empire and become separate states, right? A separate organization, a separate entity. And that, of course, is what led to one of our big things we looked at, the Declaration of Independence. And keep in mind, this Declaration of Independence has a twofold process, right, or purpose. Part of it is to explain what these colonists are fighting for, and they declare it to be their rights. Rights is understood by British subjects, that they have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as Thomas Jefferson pointed out or wrote in the Declaration. But keep in mind, those ideas weren't unique to Jefferson. They've been floating around in Britain for a long time. They were really encapsulated, really kind of formulated by that Enlightenment thinker, John Locke, almost 100 years earlier. So these weren't new ideas that Jefferson or even Thomas Paine were putting out there. These were well-established facts that a lot of British people could really respect and approve of, right? So these colonists thought they were in a very strong place. But to really make this call for independence legitimate, they have to explain that they can't find true freedom. Their rights really won't be protected under the British government. And that includes not just Parliament that they've been having a problem with, but the king as well. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, there are 23 times, 23 counts that they call the king into question on, saying you haven't done your job. And that's kind of the second part of this, right? The first part is saying we have rights as colonists that aren't being defended by the British government, and our king hasn't done his job. And because of that, Parliament and the king are working actively against us, the American colonies. We can declare ourselves independent. And they do in July of 1776. But it's not enough to declare yourself independent. You're going to have to fight for it. And as I tried to point out in the previous lecture, that's not going to be easy. The British government, although it is in debt, still has resources, right? It has a lot of money available to it. Governments can borrow massive sums even when they're heavily in debt, as we well know today, right? Our government has no problem continuing to spend money even if it is in a large amount of debt. So the British government has the same ability. It has a functioning government. It can raise revenue. It has an army. It has a navy. It has allies. They're going to be able to get those German mercenaries to go and help fight. And of course, they have a large segment of the American colonists that want to remain British, that will go and support the British government, support British troops. So this is not going to be settled quickly. Even though Thomas Paine said it's just a matter of time, it's going to be an absolute fact that these colonies are going to be an independent country that's going to be powerful. It doesn't look like it on paper right now. In a big way, this is Britain's war to lose. They have everything they need. The colonists are fighting for their homes. They are motivated by these big ideals. They do think that they're the party that's been wronged here. So that's a pretty big motivating force in and of itself. And of course, they're closer to the action. It's going to be easier for them to raise troops and get troops to battlefields than the British. But they don't have a functioning government. This Continental Congress isn't a real government. The real governments are those colonial legislatures that are now going to be state legislatures. The big thing that happens here when these colonies declare themselves independent is the Declaration of Independence doesn't create one country. It actually creates 13 little countries that are working together. And that is hard to coordinate. It is hard to get them to think about the other colonies, the other states now. Kind of mentioned that at the Battle of Bunker Hill. There are 8,000 colonists there from multiple different colonies fighting to protect Boston or to protect the rest of Massachusetts from the British Army in Boston. But these are locally minded people, right? They might be coming from as far away as Virginia, but they don't expect to be fighting for years. They're only expecting to be here to fight against the British right here, right now, and then they're going home. So this is going to be tough to coordinate. This is going to be tough to get soldiers in Georgia to want to go up and fight in New York and vice versa. This is not going to be easy in any way, shape, or form. The British government do have the easier task here in that they have the resources they need. But they also have a big task, a hard task. If the Americans just have to kind of hold on and wear out the British have to come in and crush this rebellion. They have to convince every American colonist that they're still British subjects, that they're still part of the British Empire. And that is not easy. It means you're going to have soldiers everywhere. You're going to have British authority everywhere in these colonies. And as we've seen, Britain's resources are kind of stretched a little thin here. Now, again, they can raise money to get more troops. They can build more ships to carry those troops. But they do have a big empire. And if these colonists are going to be able to get other Europeans to support them, as we know is going to happen, that's going to make things even harder for the British. They're going to have to defend that entire empire from the rest of Europe trying to take parts of that empire, especially from France and Spain, who really want to get even with Britain for their losses in the 7 Years' War. So this is going to be a difficult situation. It's not going to change or be over quickly, right? It's going to really take work on both sides. But there is kind of this sense of release here for a lot of these colonists, especially the ones calling themselves patriots. As I mentioned in the last video, they tear down kind of the monuments to being British in a lot of different places, especially in New York. They get rid of the coat of arms for the British monarchy. They pull down their statue to George III that they had just put up a decade earlier. They're going to melt it down and turn it into bullets that they're going to use to shoot at British troops, their own troops, right? So a lot's changed here in a short period of time. But it's not just enough to pull down the statues of your king and declare yourself independent. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to have to fight for it. And the simple fact is, the Americans don't have a professional army. Now they're going to try and build one, but it's always going to be much smaller than the British Army. It's always going to have trouble getting enough resources, enough supplies, keeping their troops in the field. In the end, in 1781, when this war winds down, there are actually going to be more American colonists, now Americans, wearing British uniforms, fighting in the British Army, collecting a British paycheck, than there are in the American Continental Army, the professional part of the Army. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of Americans fighting for the cause. There are. They're all over the place. They're those local militias, but they just want to fight in their home communities, maybe in their colonies. Maybe they'll go to the next door neighboring colony, but they don't want to march away for a year or 2 years from their homes. They want to stay and protect their homes, work their farms, live in their towns, whatever it might be. So this is going to be a difficult thing. And to kind of show you what's really going to happen as this kind of ill-equipped, rebellious army of American colonists, right, are trying to prove their independence, how hard a job they're going to have against a well-trained, well-equipped professional military. Take a look at one of the videos I have, right? It's from a really bad movie from the year 2000 called The Patriot. It is not historically accurate in very many ways, but it does sometimes capture the essence of what's happening. And in this particular scene called the Battle of Camden, right, this scene does point out just how difficult it's going to be for American colonists to win this war. What they're really asking of their fellow citizens now to do fighting against British troops. Now, I will warn you, there are a couple really brutal scenes. This is a battle scene. It's a war movie in some respects. So there's a lot of death and destruction. There's dismemberments. The type of weaponry they use is pretty vicious and just, lethal in a lot of ways, as all wars are. But there are some severe mutilations that take place in this scene. So if you're kind of squeamish about that kind of stuff, you don't want to watch this clip to the end. When you start seeing the cannons fire, you're probably done. Otherwise, watch it all the way through and you'll kind of see what happens over and over again in this war. It's not going to happen just once or twice. This is pretty much the way this war is going to go for these for this new United States and its military, right? So watch that film clip. You'll find it in the Chapter 6 module called the Battle of Camden Scene, and just come back to me when you're done, all right? Thank you. All right, you should have had a chance to kind of see that. And again, what you're going to notice is, for the most part, in this war, it's going to go like that battle. The Americans are going to go, they're going to put up a good fight, maybe inflict some pretty harsh losses on the British, but in the end, they're going to break and run. They're just not as well trained, they don't have as much experience, and sometimes they just don't have the leadership they need. And we kind of see that from the very beginning of this war for independence. That's what this phase is known, right? We've gone from resistance in those early years, like against the Townsend duties, to rebellion, like we did at Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill. And now we're talking about revolution, right? Just rejecting in totem the government that we've been a part of and creating a new government for ourselves. But again, to be independent, to have your own government, you have to be victorious. You have to tell the other side we're no longer part of you. So they know they're going to have a war. They're going to have to prove to the British that these American colonies are no longer colonies, but they're independent states. Now, luckily for the United States, right, these colonies, these states, they do have some resources. They have an 8,000-man army outside of Boston. And when the British evacuate and pull their troops out of Boston, there's a kind of a sense of euphoria. They go, hey, we can stand up to these guys. We can beat the British. They put a guy in charge of that army, a person by the name of George Washington. He's a fairly well-known figure from his work in the 7 Years' War as a young man, just almost 20 years earlier. Now he's in his mid-40s, right? So he's kind of seen as a good choice to lead this military, right? To lead the military effort to win independence. Now, he's not the most experienced American commander. There are former British generals that have joined the Patriot cause. They've come to the colonies to gain land or just kind of get away from Britain, and they've now decided to join the Patriots. So there are people that have a lot more military experience than George Washington. There are people that are better educated than George Washington. Again, he's not one of the wealthiest colonists in Virginia, but he's up and coming. He's married. He's accumulated some wealth from inheriting from his brother and his father, and he's married into more wealth with his wife, Martha Custis, now Martha Washington. So he does have a lot of wealth, but he's not the wealthiest out of Virginia. So it kind of asks us, why do they put him in charge? And there's a really good reason for this. Here in the 18th century, one of the things that's been driving this resistance, now rebellion, now revolution to the British government, has been this idea that you don't use armies against your own people, that you don't have armies as much as you possibly can, because it's seen as an abuse of power. It's too easy for a parliament or a king to tell military officers, go crush those people over there. I don't want to listen to them. So the British have actually done a pretty good job of keeping the British Army to a minimum, of putting it out there where it needs to protect the empire, not really letting a lot of troops march through London, march through Great Britain itself. They've just used it to kind of suppress rebellions, to defend the empire. But of course, when things like the Boston Massacre happen, then troops marching in the streets of Boston and other colonies, it's proven to them that the use of troops is abusive, right? And that's where George Washington comes in. He absolutely adheres to the idea that civilian power should be in charge of the military. The big fear here is, amongst a lot of Americans, is that if we put together a military that can actually defeat the British, whoever's in charge of that military is probably going to be able to make themselves king. There's just no way to stop it because they're going to have the power, right? But Washington has expressly said, I don't want that kind of power. I'm not going to abuse that kind of power. If I'm in charge of the military, I'm going to make sure we listen to our civilian leaders, our state legislatures, and of course the Continental Congress. That's exactly what these political leaders want to hear. So they choose Washington not because of his experience, not because he's so charismatic or rich or one of them. He is all of those things, but it's really because of his stand on what to do with an army. Washington says, I'm going to fight the British, win the war, and then that's it, I'm going home. I'm done, right? And that's what they want to hear. They want to hear somebody that's not going to abuse power, that's not going to be a danger to this experiment, this idea that we can have a government that protects our rights. So this is kind of a big moment, and it explains in part why he's chosen. The downside to all of this is, again, he doesn't have a lot of experience. He's never commanded a full-on military effort like this. He's never even commanded a large number of troops in combat other than retreating in 1754 with what was left of Braddock's army. So he's really out of his element here, right? He is really ill-prepared for this. And it shows up in his first campaign as commander, overall commander of this thing called the Continental Army. Now, he has about 2,000 professional soldiers, people that have signed up and said, I'm fighting until we win this thing. That's the professional side. Most of his troops are these militia, these local people that have said, hey, I'm fighting for a few months, maybe a year, to help defend my colony, my state now, or to win against the British. But all told, Washington does have an army of about 8,000 men. And when the British leave Boston, he knows where they're going to be heading next, and that's New York City. New York's in the middle of the colonies. It has a great port. It has a nice river that goes up into New York, the Hudson River. He knows that's a strategic location. So he takes this 8,000-man army out of Boston, Washington does, and marches them down to New York City. And when he gets there in July of 1776, he has this Declaration of Independence read out to these troops. He says, this is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for our rights. We're fighting against a corrupt government. And it is kind of inspirational. And again, it's this idea that Washington says we're fighting for a cause. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than you. It's something else, right? We're fighting for these rights. They really do matter to these colonists, or at least many of them. But when he gets his troops to New York City, he then goes about and does exactly what an inexperienced commander would do. All the wrong things. He puts a lot of his troops all over the place in New York City. Even back then, New York City was a kind of a bigger place. And most of New York City was on two things, two islands, Long Island and Manhattan Island. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal today because there's all these roads and bridges. But back then, the only way to get to these islands was by boat. And there aren't a lot of American ships. Now, I know I've said earlier that about a third of all the ships sailing around the British Empire were made in the colonies and sailed by colonists, and that is true. But they're not warships, and some of them are really small and can't carry a lot of people or a lot of stuff. So when Washington splits his army up and puts most of it on Long Island and the rest of it on Manhattan Island, he's done something you should never do as a commander, and that's split your army up. And then, because they're islands, whoever shows up with the biggest and best ships is going to be able to surround those islands and keep anybody from escaping. This is a disaster in the waiting, and it actually works out that way. When the British show up in late August, early September of 1776, they show up with a massive army, about 20,000 soldiers. Half of them get off on Long Island. That is where most of Washington's troops are. He has about 6,000 troops in what is today Brooklyn. And the British Army marches on Washington and his men. Now, Washington saw that at the Battle of Bunker Hill, these colonists, these militia, were actually able to fight pretty well if they're dug in and kind of protected a little bit from British troops. They'll give as good as they get. So he sets up a defensive line on what's called the Brooklyn Heights, some little hills that overlook most of what is the town of Brooklyn. The problem is he doesn't have enough troops to actually control the entire heights. One part of it is left unguarded. The British, not being stupid, notice that there aren't any troops over on this one side of the American lines, and they pour their troops through there and just destroy Washington's defensive line. His troops run away in panic. Many of them are captured. His army is collapsing in his first battle. Eventually, only he and about 2,000 of his 6,000 men are able to get off of Long Island. The only thing that saves them is a freak storm that comes up with a heavy fog and makes it impossible for the British Navy to catch these guys as they escape on rowboats and little fishing boats. And then it happens again on Manhattan. When Washington has what's left of his army, about 4,000 or 5,000 men now, he's once again, the British Army shows up on the island of Manhattan. Washington and his men fight a battle. They once again kind of get outmaneuvered by a more experienced British general, and Washington is forced to flee after another devastating loss. For the most part, Washington's army is starting to evaporate. They're either getting captured by the British or they're running away like in that video. They're afraid, right? They're just not prepared to deal with a professional military that the British Army is. So this is a bit of a disaster for these colonies, right? It looks like this thing might be over already. But as I mentioned earlier in this lecture, the British have a twofold mission here. Yes, they have to defeat Washington and these colonist armies, right? Their military, but then they also have to convince colonists that they're still British and that British authority is back. And at first here in New York City in September, they start doing that. As Washington's armies retreat and kind of flee away from the British troops show up and start occupying towns and villages all over, around New York City and even into New Jersey and Connecticut. They're starting to expand their influence. But they don't go too far, right? They're only maybe 20, 30 miles outside of New York City in any real shape or form. They need more troops because there's so much territory to take control of. So the entire time, the British government is sending more troops to New York. They're starting to send those German mercenaries. They're starting to raise more troops in England, in Ireland, in Scotland to send over to the colonists. Washington and his men are in trouble. All through the fall of 1776, Washington is constantly retreating, constantly retreating. What's left of his army is now in Pennsylvania and, southern New Jersey. The British occupy most of northern New Jersey now. And that's when Washington makes a big moment here, right? He comes up and decides in late 1776, when a lot of his troops are about ready to head home and give up and just kind of say, I'm just going home. Maybe I'll try again next year. We'll see what happens, right? Washington makes a daring attack. He attacks two little outposts that the British Army has. One in Trenton is a British outpost. The other, Princeton, is a Hessian mercenary outpost. And I may have the names or the actual occupations backwards, but one's a British outpost of about 800 troops, and the other is a German outpost of about 800 troops. And kind of a daring raid that's actually Washington breaks the rules of war for that period. He attacks on Christmas Day when he knows the German troops are going to be tired from drinking too much the day before. He takes advantage of what he knows to be kind of German proclivities around the holidays. And he catches the German troops unaware, and he actually wins a battle. And then he does it against a British force that comes to try and help those Germans. And he defeats them and sends them back. And this is where the big part of this plays out. Washington's two victories at Trenton and Princeton, they're important because they give hope. They convince a lot of American colonists, maybe this guy Washington can win, right? Up to this point, it's been a disaster. He's done really badly. But maybe he can win. But that is not the most important part that comes out of this. Yes, the hope part is important, but it's more how the British react. When they lose about 1,000 troops to these American colonists, they decide to pull all their troops back into New York City. They feel it's just safer that way. And that leads to a big problem. Because when those British troops showed up in the fall of 1776 to all these little towns all around New York, the people in those towns that wanted to be British, were happy to be British, liked seeing British soldiers in their streets, well, they celebrated this, right? They told their colonial friends and neighbors who were supportive of the cause for independence, see, I told you so, right? They maybe take out their frustrations. Maybe they were attacked by these patriots when the patriots were in charge, and now they return the favor, kind of attacking their neighbors that are patriots. But when the British Army leaves, if you're one of those loyalists, one of those people that stayed loyal to Britain, what's going to happen to you now? The British Army's leaving places like Trenton and Princeton, all these little towns all over the place. Do you stay and just face the music? You know those patriots are going to come back, and they're not going to be happy with you. They're going to do worse to you than you did to them. So are you going to stay and take that? But if you leave, you're leaving everything. You're leaving your house, your business, your fortunes, right? Maybe you can take some of your wealth with you, but how long is that going to last? So this is a real problem for the British. When they don't stay and just keep whatever they're conquering, they give the Patriots a chance to come back and rehabilitate themselves, right? To regain what they've lost. And that is going to be a problem for Britain over and over again. This is the crux, the core of their issue, is trying to maintain control, force colonists to accept their Britishness. They fail at that miserably. And because of that, those colonists are going to be able to continue to raise troops for George Washington, get him at least enough supplies to keep him going, enough food to keep him going for the next fight and the next fight. This is going to happen over and over and over again. And that's what makes the next year so important, right? Again, this isn't important. Here's the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, done by an American artist out of New York City, Emmanuel Lutz, right? Uh, it's nostalgic, it's inspiring, all of that kind of stuff. But we know that, and it kind of shows this ragtag little army trying to take on the British, right? And this idea that we're all together under one flag. But it's not exactly true. Most of these colonists are fighting for their individual states now. They may be leading or following Washington's example. They may be happy to serve under him. They may like serving under him. But they are fighting for their individual causes, if you will. It is not as unified a force as it kind of is depicted here. And this moment of crossing the Delaware isn't as big a deal because it doesn't really win any strategic victories for the American cause. But what it does show is that the British aren't up to the challenge, maybe, that there's weakness here, that the British aren't going to put themselves out there like they need to actually win this. And that means that the next year is a big year, right? The British need to crush this rebellion before it gets too far, and they actually come up with a plan. And on this map here, or on this screen, you're going to see that's the plan, and it's actually a brilliant plan. It's got ovals, it's got arrows, it's got numbers. It looks great. Well, okay, it makes a lot more sense if I give you that map that shows you what this plan is planning on doing. So the British government decides the way to crush this rebellion is to cut off the part of it that is supplying most of the resistance, most of the troops, most of the problems. And most people in the British government say that's New England. So let's cut New England off from the rest of the colonies, crush New England, and then the rest of the colonies will turn around and say, ooh, wow, we don't want that to happen to us. We give, we surrender, we're still British. This thing will be over. But to do that, the British are going to need a lot of troops. Now, luckily enough, they've got a huge army in New York now. But they know that's not enough because they're going to need to defend New York and send part of that army northwards to cut off New England. They know they're going to need another army. So that's where they make a big decision. They're going to send a bunch of troops from the Empire into Canada. Remember, they're in control of Canada now. Most of the people living in Canada are actually French, now part of the British Empire. So they're not going to help you. They're not interested in fighting American colonists for the British. They'll fight for themselves, but not for anybody else. So the British are going to have to send an army to Canada to help out their other army in New York crush New England. They're going to do that by sending the army under the commander of this guy in the upper right-hand corner, General John Burgoyne. Burgoyne's going to be given an 8,000-man army to march down out of Canada into New York, meet this other army coming up out of New York, somewhere in the middle of New York, and they'll have cut off New England, and then they can just turn eastward and just crush those colonies and teach them that they're still British. It's actually a really solid plan. And if the British had followed it, everything might have been different. But there's a problem. The local commander, the general in charge of the British Army in Washington, D.C., or in New York, excuse me, William Cornwallis, decides, I'm not interested in this. He thinks that this army that Burgoyne has in Canada of 8,000 men is more than enough to do the job, that his army's not going to be needed. What he's going to do instead is he's going to march west. He's going to look for George Washington, crush that rebel army, capture Philadelphia where this Continental Congress is meeting, and that will really end this rebellion. So Burgoyne arrives in Canada thinking that he's one of two armies that are marching into New York. His from the north and Cornwallis's from the south. In the end, it doesn't work out that way at all. The overall commander, William Howe, is the guy that's actually going to be running military operations in New York City, is the one that says, let's send our army out west, let's go crush Washington, and he never tells the British government that he's changed the plan. Instead of marching north, Howe tells his armies to march east, and they actually do exactly what Howe wanted them to do. Howe's army does chase Washington off. They give him a crippling defeat, but they don't capture him and crush the army. It still exists. It's still fighting out there. They are able to take the town of Philadelphia. They are able to chase off the Continental Congress, but they don't capture it. They don't capture any of the Patriot leaders. And once again, the British kind of do this thing that they've done before. When the British Army marches in, the Patriots flee in front of them. People that are loyal to Britain bring out their British flags. They celebrate the British troops. They entertain the British officers. They tell the British how happy they are to see the British there. But they're not going to stay long, right? Within about a year's time, the British are going to leave Philadelphia. Those Patriots are going to come back. And once again, if you're a loyalist, you have to make that decision, that difficult decision. Do you stay and face the music? Do you just deal with whatever the Patriots are going to do to you? Or do you flee with the British back to places like New York City and just try to reinvent your life? So we kind of see, even though the British are kind of pulling some things off, it's not what they really need to do. And that's only half of what's happening here. The big thing that happens is when Burgoyne starts marching out of Canada, down south into New York, it's hard to go there, right? There aren't a lot of roads. The rivers are small and sometimes kind of really rough, and it means that his army's got to march a lot. There are no roads, so they have to create a road as they go. It takes a lot longer than Burgoyne and the British government thought it would. He needs a lot more supplies than they thought that they would need. So this is a very slow process, but Burgoyne's not worried because he still thinks he's one of two armies. He just has to keep pushing south until he finally runs into that other British army that'll have more supplies and be able to keep him going. So eventually Burgoyne's army, by the kind of the late spring of 1777, has gotten to a place called Saratoga, right? It's a little village in upstate New York, just a little beyond Albany, New York, where the present-day capital of New York is. And there, Burgoyne's army has decided that's about as far as they can go. It's about halfway. They'll just wait for that other army to come and help them. They're kind of beyond the ability to get supplies from Canada. Their soldiers are tired. They've just worn themselves out, really. So Burgoyne's army kind of sits down around this town of Saratoga and waits, digs in. But what they find is there are all kinds of these patriots, these militias all over the place. There's a small part of the professional Continental Army out there as well. And under some really kind of inspired leadership by a guy by the name of Benedict Arnold, these little patriot forces slowly but surely hem in this bigger British army. They're finding it harder and harder for them to kind of defend themselves. They're seeming to be attacked every day from a new direction by a new group of patriots. And it's actually kind of true. Militia are being raised all throughout New England and New York and Pennsylvania, and they're rushing there to attack this army. And slowly but surely, Burgoyne's getting worried. But he knows that there's another British army coming to save him. But we know that's not going to happen. William Howe, the commander of the troops in New York, has sent his army west. They're not coming to save Burgoyne. And by September of 1777, even Burgoyne knows this is a lost cause. Nobody's coming to save him. He's out of food. He's running out of ammunition. He's losing troops all the time. Some of them are starting to desert or just surrender because they're tired of fighting. He has to do something that hasn't happened in the history of the British Army. He's got to surrender. And what makes this even wilder is he's not surrendering like in Europe to an Austrian commander or a German commander or a French commander. He's surrendering to British colonists, in his opinion, right? His own people. The British military has kind of thought of this as just a bunch of angry farmers. Well, now a bunch of angry farmers have just made a huge British army surrender to it. It is quite a blow to the British government when they get news of this. It is a pretty embarrassing scene politically, diplomatically. It really means that this war is up for grabs. And because William Howe didn't do really what he thought he was going to do, crush the government of this new country, the United States, capture their military leader and destroy their army, none of that actually happened. This becomes a really big disaster for the British government and the British military. They're kind of successful, but also failing in big ways. And the big takeaway from this moment, right, from this thing called the Battle of Saratoga, the thing we need to remember here is, as important as this victory is for the American colonists to prove to them that they can beat the British military, that they actually can pull this war off, they can win their independence, is that there's a lot of people that are inspired besides American colonists. And that, of course, are European countries. A lot of countries, as I've mentioned in the last couple of lectures, aren't really pleased seeing Britain become the most powerful country in Europe, or at least one of the most powerful countries. They want to see Britain get taken down a little bit. Britain's a threat to a lot of these countries, especially to France and Spain that lost so much in the last war against Britain. Secretly, France has already been funneling money to these colonies, supplying weapons to these colonies, supplying military supplies to these colonies in an effort to kind of hurt Britain as much as it can. But now the French government, the French king, sees a real opportunity. They might not be able to get Canada back, but they might be able to take away North America from the British as well, right? So if we can't have it, nobody can have it. And that idea starts permeating the French government. They start deciding, reaching out to these American colonists saying, hey, maybe we should form an alliance. And because of this victory, because it shows these colonists actually might be able to pull this thing off, the French decide in 1778 to announce an alliance with this new United States. They have officially recognized us as a new country. They have now formed a military alliance with us. This thing called the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 is huge. It changes the nature of the war because when France and Britain go to war again, the rest of Europe has to divide up. And what ends up happening this time is a lot of Britain's normal allies, the Netherlands, the Prussians, they don't join in this time. They don't go onto Britain's side. Britain has to fight France and Spain primarily on its own, which means its resources are going to be stretched even thinner than before. It also means that these Americans, besides getting help from France and Spain, their traditional enemies, which is really ironic here, they can also reach out to the Netherlands and to Prussia and other countries for loans, for money, and they're actually going to get it sometimes, right? Again, most countries do kind of want to see Britain taken down a notch here. So 1777 changes everything. It even gets worse for the British in 1778 when they pull out of Philadelphia. Once again, a bunch of loyalists come with them back to New York they want British protection. But those that don't have to decide, hey, I'm a patriot now, right? Otherwise, I'm in really bad shape here. So Britain's not doing its job, right? It's not conquering the colonies, convincing everybody you're still British. And on top of that, the war is now a worldwide war again. Britain has to defend not just its American colonies, right? But it has to defend Canada. It has to defend the islands in the Caribbean. It has to defend islands in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. This war has just gotten huge. So this is a massive thing that's taking place now, this war for American independence. And it's merging into a bigger war between France and Britain. And really, when you get down to it, if you're the British here in 1778, your focus really starts to change. Yeah, you don't like these colonists declaring themselves independent and a new country. You kind of feel they're ungrateful, that they've caused a lot of problems. But they're not the real enemy, right? The real enemy's been the enemy you've been fighting for 100 years, actually for hundreds of years, and that's the French. So the people of Britain, even the British government, start concentrating more and more on dealing with their enemies in Europe and less dealing with these colonists, which again gives them an edge, gives people like Washington a breather, right? Gives them a chance to put his army back together after their disaster at Philadelphia, train more troops as they get more supplies and more money. They're never going to have enough, but they always seem to be able to get enough to keep in the fight, right? So the American colonists are actually doing exactly what they need to do. They're not giving up. They keep pushing Britain. They keep kind of pushing back against Britain, and they keep announcing their independence. They're doing a better job all the time. But let me tell you in no uncertain terms here, this thing doesn't work out successfully without France joining the fight. Without French money, without French troops, without French ships, without French supplies, we're not going to win this thing. because France diverts so much attention from the British, right, from the American colonists to France. That's the only reason that these colonists are able to kind of even come close to dealing with the British on their own. And we actually have some proof for that, right? It's what happens next. After 1778, the British decide, okay, cutting off New England didn't work. It looks like New York, we're only able to hold on to New York City, and that's about it. We really can't expand our control outside of New York City. We can't even keep parts of Pennsylvania or New Jersey. The British military is really trapped in New York in the northern colonies. And that's when they decide to turn their attention to the South. There's a lot of talk in the British government about the fact that there's a lot of support for Britain in these southern colonies, places like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and especially Georgia. A lot of the colonists there have come from parts of Britain that are loyal, right? They were born in Britain. They were born in Scotland or Wales or England. They still think of themselves as British. So here in the southern colonies, it's probably closer to 50-50, right? Remember what I told you in the last lecture. We estimate, based on what colonists are saying, that about a third of them were patriots, about a third of them were loyalists in most of the colonies. Which means there's a third in the middle that were kind of up for grabs. Could you get them to join your side or the other side? Well, in the southern colonies, it's probably a lot more clearly divided. Yes, there are still people in the middle that just want to be left alone. That's almost always true in these kind of conflicts. But here, there's a very large number of loyalists, and there's a large number of patriots, and they don't like each other. Most of the patriots tend to be these larger landholders, these people that control and dominate their legislatures, that have the political power, that have most of the wealth. Being independent is actually good for them. They'll be the ones in charge of their states, and they'll be able to make a lot of decisions, and they'll benefit economically from being in charge. Most of the loyalists are going to be small farmers, people that resent that control that the elites have, these big plantation owners have. They kind of see this as a way for them to kind of get even. The British government senses this, right? This is this breakdown in these colonies. And they start shipping troops to the South as they kind of see things in the North fizzling out. In 1778, they take the major port city of Savannah, Georgia, which really kind of controls the state of Georgia. Now, they aren't able to take the colonial legislature. Again, the Patriots are able to kind of escape and keep a force out there, but they really do kind of control most of the colony of Georgia in 1778 when they take Savannah. In 1780, they send a large military force to Charleston. They tried it earlier in like 1776, and they failed. But here in 1778, they bring a much larger force, and the British are able to take Charleston as well. So now the British have two bases to operate from in the South, and they have a pretty big army, about a 6,000-man army under the command of Cornwallis. And this British general decides, I'm going to march out of my base of Charleston. I'm going to march out there into what is today South Carolina, the colony of South Carolina at the time. And this British general is going to just crush these patriots and their military forces. Now, what is truly interesting here is at the Battle of Saratoga, Washington was nowhere near it, and it was a victory for the colonists. The same is going to happen down here. George Washington is really not there. Now, he's picked some of the commanders that are there, so he gets some credit for choosing good guys that know how to do their job. But again, Washington's actually not here. Washington is going to lose most of his battles. He very rarely wins anything. Most of his battles are losses. That's not what he's great for. Again, why he's important is he won't abuse his power as being the overall commander of these troops, and he can keep them in the fight, right? Even though he's losing all the time, he can keep putting up a fight against the British and forcing the British to do their job, right? But down here in these southern colonies, there is no George Washington. He's up north in Pennsylvania at the time. This British general in 1780 takes his army out there to deal with these American forces that are in the area, these Patriot forces. And at that Battle of Camden, and that's kind of the first movie clip I showed you, right? It goes pretty well for the British. They're able to chase off those American forces. They're able to defeat them. Most of those Americans fighting there were actually militia. In the movie, that makes them look like professional troops. Most of them weren't. They were actually these militia. And when the militia ran, the professional troops were so outnumbered, they had to run too. But again, sort of like with Washington, they may run, but they don't give up. They reform and fight back again. At the next battle, it goes the American way. The American commander, Nathaniel Greene, handpicked by George Washington, is actually a pretty capable commander, and he beats Cornwallis. And the big thing that happens at this this battle called the Battle of Kings Mountain is Cornwallis can't run back to Charleston. His army's actually been outmaneuvered and he's in trouble. So he knows he has to run north. He's got to get north to where he can find help from the British Navy and get more supplies and more men. So he starts marching north. At another battle called Guilford Courthouse, he's once again defeated by Greene in this American Patriot Army. And now he's really worried. He's losing a lot of men. He's lost a lot of supplies. And now he's really in the middle of nowhere. He decides there's only one place he can go where he can get help. And that's on the Virginia coast at a little port town called Yorktown. If he can get there, the British Army will come and rescue him, to bring him supplies, more men, and then he can march out and maybe kind of devastate the territory. So here in 1778, 1780, the British once again look like they're kind of doing their job, and then it starts falling apart. Now, they are keeping the towns of Savannah and Charleston just like they're keeping New York, but they're not keeping any of the territory around it. As the British armies march through, they just march away, right? They don't leave anything behind to kind of convince everybody that the British are in charge. The Patriots just kind of come in right behind them, and everything kind of goes back to Patriot control. So this becomes a big moment, right? The war's gotten way bigger. It's being fought all across the world now. And once again, a British army finds itself in trouble. Cornwallis is able to get his military force there to Yorktown, but then he has a big problem. To kind of see what that problem is, you'll want to look at the next clip I have from this really bad movie, The Patriot. It does kind of show just the pressure that Cornwallis is under, but it also shows something else really important. So I'm going to stop for a second. I would like you to go watch that second film clip called the Battle of Yorktown film clip from The Patriot, and then come back to me and I'll kind of explain a little bit of what we saw there, okay? All right, you should have had a chance to see that now. So what I wanted you to see there is that this thing called the Battle of Yorktown, it is going to be a victory for George Washington. He's going to get his army down there from Pennsylvania. The army from here in the Carolinas under Nathaniel Greene marches up there. So there's actually a really big American army at Yorktown. It's actually bigger than the British army that's there. But what is also there that maybe shows up in that film clip a little bit is the fact that there is a French army there as well. So the British aren't just kind of outnumbered, they're way outnumbered here. The French have actually sent military forces to the colonies to help these Americans gain their independence. That is a big game changer. It's making this war winnable for these colonists. The other big thing that happens is, for one of the few times in the history of the British and French and all their wars, one of the few times that a French fleet defeated a British naval fleet happens at Yorktown. So what is kind of really wild about all of this is the few times that the French actually are able to defeat the British in these wars that they keep fighting have not been for the benefit of France. They've actually been for the benefit of an entirely new country called the United States. So what is wild here is the French cut off this Cornwallis army, right? This British army at Yorktown is cut off. The British Navy can't come in and resupply them. A French fleet actually drives them off. It only happens a handful of times, and one of the most important times it ever happens for us, not for France. So it is truly ironic that France is bankrupting itself bankrolling this war for the American colonists. They're sending troops to fight for these colonists. Their navy's fighting for these colonists. And what are the French going to get out of it? Well, not a lot, except one of the scenes there is really kind of important. And I kind of want to break this down for you a little bit. The American actor that's kind of the hero of the movie, he's an American actor, an Australian-American actor by the name of Mel Gibson. He's the guy that's kind of the father figure in the first film clip that's talking to his son watching the Battle of Camden. Here in the second film clip, he's talking to a French officer, right? And this guy that Mel Gibson's portraying is a historical figure that they've taken a lot of liberties with in this movie, so it's not entirely accurate. But there was an American patriot, kind of a militia figure like Mel Gibson's character in this movie, that had fought against the French in the 7 Years' War. He'd actually fought with the British Army against the French and their native allies. He learned how to fight in that war. And now he's using those skills against the very army he fought with. And what is truly wild about that film clip is here is an American patriot who used to fight and kill French soldiers, fighting with a French soldier against the very army that patriot used to work with, the British Army. That is how quickly things have changed here. In less than 20 years, people like Francis Marion, that's the character's name and the historical figure, have changed from being British to being American. And that is an incredible change that's taken place here, right? That's a huge transformation, if you will. But they're not the only ones being changed. While they're having this exchange, Francis Marion, Mel Gibson's character, and this French officer played by Gerard Depardieu, they have this little exchange between each other. Francis Marion, the character, says to the French officer, "Vive la France," right? He says, "Long live France. Great job, France. Thanks for helping us win this war." 20 years earlier, that could not have happened, right? They would have been shooting and killing each other, but now they're friends. Now they're working together. That is how important the Battle of Saratoga is. It makes that moment possible. But listen to what the French officer, Gerard Depardieu's character, says back to that American patriot. He doesn't say, "Viva la United States." He says something else. He says, "Viva la liberté." Viva liberty. What's happened here, and what I like about that film clip that's actually kind of absorbed here, is that these French soldiers fighting in this war, watching these colonists do what they're doing, the things they're talking about, these French officers and French soldiers are starting to pick up this idea that, hey, you should have a government that represents you, that you have a voice and control over. If you don't have a voice in it, if you don't have control over it, it's not a legitimate government. That idea of liberty, of accountability, of democracy is starting to permeate here, right? And these French soldiers are going to bring that stuff home to France. So kind of keep this in mind, just to show you how badly this war goes for France and not just Britain. France is about to bankrupt itself, bankrolling the Americans here. The Americans aren't going to be able to pay this money back to France. They just don't have it. So the French government, excuse me, is going to struggle to pay its bills because of this war. And as they raise taxes on their people to pay for this war because the Americans can't pay those loans back, their own people, the French people, start saying, hey, wait a minute, this seems wrong. Why do I have to keep paying taxes to a government that doesn't allow me to have a say on those taxes? Why is a government telling me what I can and can't do? Shouldn't I be telling the government what it can and can't do? That's what those Americans are doing. So it is really wild here. Just a few years after this Battle of Yorktown becomes a big victory for these American colonists, helps wind this war down, helps seal the victory for these colonists, France is going to launch into its own revolution on these ideas. So what I want you to really take away from this part of it, this Battle of Yorktown is also incredibly important, just like the Battle of Saratoga was. The Battle of Saratoga said these Americans can win, and it makes it possible for Europeans to come and support them. The Battle of Yorktown says these Americans are going to win, And it's because of French help that they're going to win. But because of all the aid France is giving, it's going to change France as well. Right? This American Revolution has really just gotten going. Remember, we're talking about two things here. The war for independence is whether this will be a separate country. This thing called the American Revolution is who's in charge of this new country. And those ideas of who gets to be in charge, who gets to have a voice, are now starting to permeate not just the American colonies, the American states, they're starting to go international. People in the Caribbean are starting to talk about this stuff. Slaves in the Caribbean are saying, hey, wait a minute, why should we be slaves? We could fight back just like these guys are. They're starting to do it in places like Haiti. So this thing called the American Revolution is starting to spread across the world just like this war is. It's being carried by this war to other parts of the world, right? So this is a big moment. But when the colonists once again win at Yorktown, when the British commander says, look, I got to face the facts. There's nobody coming to rescue me. I'm running out of supplies. My troops are running out of bullets. We have to surrender. For the second time in British history, a British army has to surrender. And this time they want to surrender to their own troops, their own people, American colonists, because surrendering to the French would just be unthinkable. So the American commander George Washington is sought out by the British officers, and they surrender to him specifically. So Washington looks like a big hero here. He's done it. He's won the war for us. But it's really the French that have won this war for us. It's their money, their troops, their ships that have actually been the difference here. Otherwise, this thing could have been going on, may have already been over in the British favor, right? So there's a lot happening here. We have to kind of keep in mind that there are two things happening coterminously here. There is this war for American independence that is now largely won. It's not officially over, but it's largely won by this thing called the Battle of Yorktown. But this thing called the American Revolution, as I said earlier, who's going to be in charge here? What is going to emerge if we're not British anymore? What does it mean to be an American? What kind of government is the United States going to have? Are we just going to be 13 independent states? 13 independent countries, essentially? Or is there something else? Are we going to band together in some way? Those are some big questions to kind of have here, right? That's the American Revolution. And that's what we're going to kind of look at next, right? Now that the military aspects of this war are kind of over, we need to kind of look at the impact that this war is having on these American colonies, now American states. They're being transformed by this war in a lot of different ways. First thing we want to look at is what this war means for this vast number of people, growing number of people that didn't ask to be brought here. For blacks in America, right? Now, most African Americans in the colonies, now states, were enslaved, but not all. There was a large number of free blacks as well, right? People that actually were free, not enslaved, lived their own lives. Most of those people lived either in places like Virginia or South Carolina, where they had won their freedom or gained their freedom over the course of their lives. A few lived in the northern colonies where slavery wasn't as prevalent and where earning your freedom or even making enough money to buy your freedom was much more common. But for Black Americans, this war is full of irony, is the way to look at it. And one of the best ways to see that irony is in something that happens before the war even officially gets going. It happens in November of 1775. The British governor of Virginia issues a proclamation that month of November trying to regain control of Virginia. Virginia, like Massachusetts, has been kind of at the forefront of this resistance and now rebellion. Remember, 1775, Lexington, Concord, and the Battle of Bunker Hill have taken place. The king has just declared these colonies in rebellion. And the British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, John Murray is his official name, but his title is Lord Dunmore, has found that he's in trouble here in Virginia. He doesn't have enough troops to control the colony, and the state legislature, or the colonial legislature, depending on if you're a patriot or a loyalist here, is actively working against the British government. They're raising troops, they're sending supplies to Boston, right, to try and get rid of those British troops. They're working against the British government. So as a representative of the British government, Dunmore has to do something to try and regain control here. The colonial elites, the people like Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Monroe, right? They're the ones that are in this legislature, the House of Burgesses. They're the ones passing these resolutions to oppose the British government. So Lord Dunmore decides he's going to hit them where it hurts. He issues a proclamation, not only saying that these colonists are out of control and they're going against the British government, but he does something else as well. He proclaims that the British government will give liberty, give freedom to any enslaved black person that wants to come and help the British. Now, Dunmore has a few British soldiers. They're holed up in a couple of small port towns in Virginia. And he basically says in his proclamation, if you can get to us British outposts where we have authority, we'll give you your freedom and give you a chance to stay free. That's really what the heart of his proclamation is. So our question here is, why is he doing this? Why is Dunmore issuing a proclamation not to white colonists saying, hey, why aren't you staying British? Why aren't you supporting your government? Why is he issuing it to enslaved black colonists and saying, please join us? Well, there's method to the madness here, right? For the most part, poor white farmers in places like Virginia and South Carolina, New Jersey, right? They don't own slaves. They can't afford them. They just have small farms that they work themselves with their families. And because of that, they don't have a lot of wealth. They can't afford an education, which means they're not going to be able to get a lot more land. They're not going to be able to become very wealthy. It's going to be very difficult for them. It's going to be hard for them to send their kids to school so that their kids can get better careers, get more money, get more land. They're going to be kind of born poor and stay poor generation after generation. So why can't they get an education? Why can't they get loans easier to buy more land? Well, if you're Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Patrick Henry, all these rich colonists that have lots of land, grow lots of tobacco, own lots of slaves, these poor farmers are your competition. You don't want them getting an education. You don't want them getting more land, because they'll just compete against you, right? It'll be another person producing what you produce, making the value of your product go lower. So the House of Burgesses in Virginia and the colonial legislature in South Carolina and every other colony where slave labor is common has made land very hard to get to keep poor farmers poor. So if you're Dunmore, you know this. You know who's going to be on your side. Poor white farmers are more likely to want to stay British. And that's kind of tying back to what I was saying earlier. It's why the British think they're going to get a lot of help in these southern colonies like Virginia, like South Carolina, like North Carolina, because they know there are a lot of poor white farmers that resent the power of the elites in their colonies who own most of the slaves, who have most of the wealth. Dunmore's playing to that. If he can get slaves to run away from Washington's plantation, Jefferson's plantation, and come and join the British, it hurts their pocketbooks. It hurts their authority. It gives these small farmers a chance to maybe start taking some authority for themselves, and they'll probably stay British. So Dunmore comes up with kind of a unique plan here, right? He's going to hurt patriots and help the British. And if you're an enslaved person in this new country called the United States after this proclamation comes out, right? What is truly another irony here is that it's not the people fighting for their rights that are giving freedom out. It's the people that are giving freedom are the ones that the patriots say are trying to take away liberty and freedom, right? It just shows you just how convoluted this is. Patriots are claiming the British government is taking away their freedom and trying to enslave them politically. While at the same time, a lot of these patriots are literally enslaving people and denying them their freedom that they say in their Declaration of Independence that all men are entitled to. The British government, the agency that actually is trying to politically oppress colonists, are the only ones actually giving freedom to enslaved people. So again, this thing called the American Revolution is complex. There's a lot of moving parts. Not everybody, not one side is the good guys and not one side is the bad guys. The British do some bad things, right? They are oppressive to these colonists. But at the same time, they also offer freedom to some of those colonists. These patriots are fighting for their freedom, especially their political freedom. But at the same time, they're hypocrites because they're not giving that freedom to everybody. Thomas Jefferson says all men are created equal. Now, he doesn't mean that the way we do, but you can't just write all men are created equal and not think people are going to say that means me, right? I'm all. I'm part of this. And we're going to see that that's really the heart of the American Revolution here. And Dunmore's proclamation is bringing that up. Just who is an American? What does it mean when we say all men are created equal? Well, Dunmore's proclamation is testing that before this country even gets started. He's saying, well, hey, look, these slaves, they can run away to us and we'll treat them like people. It's his way of hurting these patriots. It's his way of getting British authority back in control. And he's really appealing to these poor white farmers, many of whom are going to like to see those slaves run away. They're not going to maybe stop those slaves. They're going to say, hey, the British Army's right over there, go to them, because it's good for them, right? It reduces the power of these local elites. So there's a lot of moving parts here, and we have to kind of keep that in mind, right? So we kind of answered a lot of these questions. But there's one last thing I want to talk about where we come to when we come to Dunmore's proclamation. And that, of course, is another long-lasting impact here. When slaves run away and join the British, they do take a lot of economic power with them, right? I mean, patriot owners like George Washington are relying on slave labor to keep their wealth going while they're fighting this war, and that's being taken away from them. For the entire course of the war, Washington, fighting against the British government, is going to write letters to the British government saying, hey, some of my slaves have run away to you. Can you send them back? Now, to their credit, the British government is going to say, no, right? We made them a promise, and their British are going to actually live up to that promise. Somewhere between 20 and 50,000 African Americans run away from slave owners to the British. And they're going to find freedom with the British that they could never find with these patriots who say they're fighting for freedom. True irony here. Now, in some of the northern colonies where there are more free blacks than enslaved blacks, some of them are actually going to join the patriots to prove that they're part of this system, to prove that they are a part of this community, to do their part for this new country. Because in doing their part, then they can say, look, what is happening to us being enslaved is wrong. So this is very complex, right? In the North, you have free blacks fighting for the Patriots. In the southern colonies, you have enslaved blacks running away to the British, sometimes getting armed by the British, although that's pretty rare, to be honest with you. Most of the time, the British are just going to use runaway slaves as labor themselves, although they're going to free them and pay them for their labor. But when the British do give up at the end of the war, somewhere around 50,000 former slaves leave with the British to go back to Great Britain or other parts of the empire and as free people. So that is a big, big thing, right? Another big thing to take away from this is that all men are created equal is a big line, right? And it makes some of these patriots, especially in the northern colonies, think about it. They go, look, we say we're fighting for freedom. Here are black Americans who aren't always treated fairly, fighting with us for that freedom. It means they're like us. They're like everybody. Human beings are the same, period. They understand freedom just like white Americans understand freedom. And because of that, it means what we're doing, owning other human beings, is wrong. A lot of northern states almost immediately start talking about getting rid of slavery. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. In a lot of places, it's going to take generations to happen. As a matter of fact, I think it's Pennsylvania doesn't get rid of slavery. The last slave isn't freed until like 1850. So this isn't going to happen quickly. But from almost the minute this war starts, after declaring independence in 1776, a lot of northern states, from Pennsylvania northwards, start thinking about what this means and how slavery is kind of antithetical to what we say this is about. The big impact of this is that slavery becomes more regional. The northern states, after they win their independence, start getting rid of slavery. The southern states start relying on it more and more and more. It is a clear break. So again, kind of pointing out where we're going in this class. Before we're even a country, slavery permeates all of these colonies. But once we declare our independence and start trying to create an independent nation, something changes here. This country splits on the question of slavery. Northern states say slavery is not really compatible with this idea of freedom and liberty, right? You can't be both, a slave nation and a free nation. Southerners, on the other hand, say, well, all men are created equal doesn't apply to them because they're not people, which is obviously not true, right? I mean, we'll talk about this more in the coming weeks, but white Southerners are really kind of creating a fiction for themselves because it's good for their economic interests. And those are things that we have to kind of see coming down the road here. Here in the American Revolution, in the War for Independence, we see that there is a huge problem for this new country. They kind of recognize it too, but they just can't deal with it because they're dealing with so many other things, right? They just say this is something that'll have to wait. The problem is when you have a big problem and you wait and you ignore it, it doesn't get smaller and go away. It just gets bigger and worse. And we kind of see that handwriting on the wall from almost the very beginning. So a couple other things to kind of point out here, and that was the scene from the Battle of Yorktown. I got these slides a little bit out of order. Sorry about that. Some other things that we want to talk about are some of the other impacts, the other ways that this war is going to change these colonies and precipitate this thing called the American Revolution. After the Battle of Saratoga and after our alliance with France, even though France is pumping a tremendous amount of money into these American states, it is not nearly enough. Remember, most of our wealth for these colonies, for these states, came from trade in the British Empire. That trade has been completely disrupted now for a number of years, right? Really since 1774, this trade has just been plummeting and almost non-existent. It means that these colonies, now states, are in real financial trouble. The only way they're staying afloat is by taking out massive loans from all over Europe. And not only are the states taking out loans, but so is that Continental Congress. They're taking out more loans to fund Washington and his troops and everything else they need to do. So what we kind of find is here by the time the Battle of Yorktown happens, these states and this new country are in economic danger, right? Their monetary policies are bad. Their money is worthless, right? They've been reduced to, once again, printing paper money. And a lot of people won't even use it. They won't accept it. What they had to do at the very end to make this money worth anything is say it was worth goods, right? That you could literally turn in this paper money and get paid in tobacco leaves or some other commodity. This is essentially the barter system. You give me this many pounds of that, and I'll give you this many pounds of this, right? So these colonies, these states, are in a lot of trouble. They're finding it hard to keep going. They're finding it harder to put troops in the field, to feed those troops, to keep things going. Yorktown, in some ways, might be their last gasp, right? And luckily enough for them, it works. It happens. A lot of people are starting to leave the military to concentrate on their farms, to concentrate on keeping their families going. The war is becoming less and less important to Americans, especially after the Battle of Yorktown. The British, on the other hand, are having some similar problems. They have a big army, it's well equipped, but it costs a lot of money. We know that the British government is already worried about how much money they're spending, and now this war has just gotten bigger, fighting against fighting against France and Spain all over the world, and it's getting harder to pay these bills. So what we kind of see is after the Battle of Yorktown, there's a big interest in everybody coming to the table here in settling this war. By 1781, everybody, including the British, the French, and the American colonists, are all saying, let's meet, let's start hashing this out, let's end this thing. Because economically, they are all a mess. This war has completely disrupted trade in the Atlantic world, right? These colonies and their empires are just not functioning because of this war. It has gotten that big and that out of control that it is threatening to cripple everybody's economies. So there's a lot happening here in this thing called the War for American Independence, right? But what we really want to turn our attention to is this thing called the Revolution. Because even as the War for American Independence is winding down, as it becomes obvious that these colonies are going to become an independent nation, this thing called the American Revolution is still going. It will continue to go for several more years. So again, kind of have to remember there are multiple things happening at the same time here. What we're going to turn our attention to is this thing called the American Revolution to kind of wrap things up. And one of the things I want to point out, one of the big changes that's happening here is the impact that the running around talking about we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for our rights, is having on all American colonists, not just the George Washingtons and Thomas Jeffersons and John Adams of the world, but even guys like we know, George Hughes, right? That's the picture of this guy. Remember, he's the guy that was there at the Boston Tea Party, helped throw the tea overboard and destroy it. He actually worked side by side with John Hancock, one of the richest people, to destroy that tea. And what happens to him, the transformation that takes place in George Hughes, to George Hughes, over the course of this war for independence, shows us the power of this thing called the American Revolution. It's what we historians call the leveling effect. And the best way to explain that, what's happening here, is to give you a couple of stories, right? Now remember, what I kind of told you earlier on when we were talking about the Boston Tea Party, is that George Hughes is a poor shoemaker, right? So he's a skilled worker, and he owns his own business, but he doesn't own land. He actually rents space in a building where his shoe shop is. He rents space where he and his wife lives. He's not a particularly great shoemaker, to be honest with you, so he doesn't make a lot of money. Most of his money goes to keeping a place for them to live, keeping his business open, and barely enough food and clothing to keep them going as a family. He is what we would call poor. And because he's landless, he really hasn't had a political voice in Boston, Massachusetts up to this point. But he's agreed with a lot of this rhetoric that's been floating around from people like John Dickinson and others who said the British government is oppressing us. It's oppressing all of us, not just us rich people that have land, but you poor people that don't have land are being oppressed too. Because when you go to buy your newspaper, when you go to take out a deed, you're going to have to pay these taxes whether you like it or not, and you absolutely have no voice. So people like George Hughes have said, you know what, you're right. The British government is taking advantage of me and I should oppose it. And he's been pretty proud of his participation. And he helps that's why he goes and helps in the Boston Tea Party. It's why he's very proud of the fact that he worked side by side with John Hancock. Here he is, one of the poorest people in Boston. John Hancock's one of the richest people in Boston, if not the richest. And they're working to the same goal here. Oppose the British government, make sure they have their voice heard, right? That the British government listens to them, even if they don't have a say in Parliament. So that's the beginnings of this leveling effect, this idea that we're all in this together, right? That these things affect all of us. But it goes deeper than that. There's a big changeover that happens. And the best way to explain this change that's happening is to tell you the story of George Hughes before all of this started. really kind of towards the end of the 7 Years' War. George Hughes is a young guy in 1763 or 1765, right after the war is over. And he's just started his own shoe business in Boston. He was actually trained by somebody in a neighboring town on how to make shoes. He was an apprentice, is what it's called. And it was kind of expected that when you were an apprentice and you learned a trade from somebody, that you would move to another town so you didn't compete against the person that trained you, right? And that kind of makes sense. You're not training your own competition. You're not training somebody to put you out of business. And there was this idea that you should kind of look out for each other in colonial society, right? It's kind of a carryover from traditions back home in England and Britain. So George Hughes moves to Boston, and he opens up his own little shoe shop, right? He rents out some space, finds a place for him and his wife to live, and he puts out his sign saying, hey, I'm open for business. And what's kind of expected in colonial society, the way the world was working before all of this happened, is that when somebody like George Hughes came to town and opened his business, rich people like John Hancock would go to those businesses and give those new businesses money, right? Buy things from them. It's called patronage. And that was kind of the idea. That was your responsibility as a rich, wealthy person in these colonies, is to kind of spread the wealth, to kind of make people feel like they were a part of the community. It didn't mean you had to do all of your shopping with this one guy, right? You just went and kind of welcomed them and gave them some of your business so that their business could get going, right? And of course, when somebody like John Hancock went to a business, you expected, because you're coming there to spend your money with them, that they're going to treat you with respect. It's called deference, right? That's what it was called in colonial terms, is people like George Hughes that weren't rich, weren't powerful, had to recognize the fact that this rich, powerful person is coming into your store because they know it's their duty. Your duty as George Hughes, as somebody like him, is to show respect to that person, to acknowledge their authority, their power, their wealth. And that's kind of actually what happens here. George Hughes opens up his shoe shop, and John Hancock comes to give him some of the business, give him some of his business, to kind of welcome him to the town, so to speak. So one day, John Hancock walks in. George Hughes already knows who this guy is. Everybody's told him who John Hancock is. You can see him on the streets of Boston on a daily basis. When John Hancock walks into his shoe shop, George Hughes knows this is a big moment. If he can do a good job for John Hancock, if he can win John Hancock's business, he might be able to get the business of John Hancock's friends and his circle of acquaintances, and this could be great for George Hughes's business. So George Hughes drops everything that he's doing, shows John Hancock a tremendous amount of respect, deference in their terms, and does the absolute best job he can. He measures John Hancock's feet multiple times. He takes detailed notes on what kind of shoes, what kind of designs John Hancock wants on this new pair of shoes. He tries to get everything just perfect because George Hughes knows it needs to be perfect to keep this guy's business, to keep him coming back to his shop. So after a lengthy period of time, John Hancock says, thanks, I expect my shoes in a couple weeks, and here's part of the money, so that George Hughes has the money he needs to go out and buy the materials and make this shoe. The profits will come when he delivers the shoes to John Hancock. So George Hughes, of course, when Hancock leaves, starts working immediately on Hancock's shoes, tries to make them the best he possibly can, tries to do the best job he possibly can. He's got a lot riding on this. And when, after a couple weeks, these shoes are done, George Hughes is going to deliver them personally. Again, deference, right? Show some respect. Thank John Hancock for giving him the opportunity here of serving him, of getting that business. So George Hughes goes to John Hancock's mansion that is there in the middle of Boston. It's one of the biggest houses, one of the nicest houses. Everybody knows where this mansion is located, where John Hancock lives. So George Hughes walks up to John Hancock's mansion, but he doesn't go up to the front door. Instead, he walks around the side of the mansion to the back door. And ask yourself, why in the world doesn't he walk up to the front door and knock and deliver like every delivery person does in America today? Well, that's the old ways, though, right? George Hughes is working under the way the colonial world did right back then. You see, George Hughes isn't a guest. He's not an equal, one of John Hancock's peers. He's a servant. He's somebody doing a job. Where do servants enter the house? Where do they work? Not in the front, not in the library, not in the meeting rooms, in the back, in places like the kitchen and the workshops. That's where George Hughes goes. He walks around to the back, he knocks on the kitchen door. One of the servants answers because George is a servant. He talks to one of the servants, says, "Hey, I have a delivery for John Hancock. I have his shoes ready." The servants bring him in, have him wait there in the kitchen. The library, the meeting rooms, those are for guests, important people, the equivalents in society of a John Hancock. George Hughes is not any of those things, so he'll wait there in the kitchen. When John Hancock shows up, George Hughes will bow, will thank John Hancock for his business, say, "Here are your shoes, sir." Hancock takes the shoes, thanks George for doing a good job, for producing the shoes on time, gives him a little tip for his efforts, and thanks him. Now, in the end, George Hughes is, again, not a great shoemaker, right? He's not the best at this stuff. The shoes are okay, but they're not great. Somebody like John Hancock is not going to come back to George Hughes's shop, and he never will. And because of that, George Hughes is going to stay poor. He makes shoes for poor people. They're okay quality, but they're not great. He stays poor the rest of his life. It's one of the reasons why his wife asks him, "Did you bring home any of that tea tonight?" when George Hughes destroys the tea at the Boston Tea Party. Hughes, of course, is going to say, "No, that would be stealing. We were there for a political purpose, to kind of say something." But as this revolution takes place, as he participates in this war for independence, George is going to go and fight for this new country, fight for the state of Massachusetts. Something changes in him. A few years later, after he's been at sea a couple times fighting with what eventually will become the United States Navy, right? George Hughes comes home to the streets of Boston. He's walking down the streets, and here comes one of these rich merchants. Now, it's not John Hancock. John Hancock is off with the Continental Congress. But George Hughes sees one of these rich merchants coming down the road. And it's expected under the old ways of deference, the old colonial ways, that when rich people walk by, poor people get out of the way and tip their hats and say good day. They greet their peers, right? They greet those people that are above them in station, is what I'm trying to say. And this merchant that's walking at George Hughes knows who George is, right? Again, Boston's a much smaller town. People know each other much better back then. This merchant knows George to be a poor person in town. He can tell by the way George is dressed. This merchant expects George to get out of the way, tip his hat, and say good day, right? To give him some kind of greeting and acknowledgement of his station. But as these two men are walking at each other on this Boston street, it becomes pretty clear that George isn't going to move. That pretty soon they're standing almost face to face. And essentially, this Boston merchant looks at George and says, "What gives? Why aren't you getting out of the way? Why aren't you greeting me? Why aren't you showing me deference?" And here's the big thing, right? Here's the thing that tells us something has changed here. George Hughes's response is, and we have this from George Hughes's diary and interviews, his response to this merchant telling him, "Get out of the way and show me deference," is, "I tip my hat to no man." I mean, think about this. One of the poorest people in Boston is telling one of the richest people in Boston, "I don't have to get out of your way. I don't have to tip my hat. I don't even have to talk to you if I don't want to." Something has happened to George Hughes, right? He's thinking, "Hey, look, I fought. I have helped create this country. That means that all men created equal part. That means me. I'm part of all." That's the leveling effect we historians are talking about. People like George Hughes, as poor as they might be, as landless as they might be, they actually believe they have these rights that they've been fighting for. They've been told they have them just by being born. Well, George Hughes has been born and he's now fought for this country and helped create this country. He believes he has those rights. And if you stop and think about it, if you're one of these colonial leaders like a John Hancock or Sam Adams, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, you may not have meant all men are created equal the way George Hughes understands it, But once this war is over, you kind of have to agree to that. You may not want everybody participating, but for people like George Hughes, white landless men that have done their part, you're going to have to give them something. You're going to have to give them some political say because they feel they're entitled to it. Indeed, they have earned it. So these are big things that are happening. The nature of these colonies has been swept away and something new has been built, right? This idea that all men are created equal is now out there, and some people are actually applying it. They're saying that means me. You have to treat me differently. So slowly but surely over time, the need to own land becomes less and less important politically in this country. People like George Hughes think that they have a political voice, that even though he doesn't own land, he can vote. Even though he doesn't own land, he could run for office. Maybe not George Hughes, but people like him will start doing those things. This country is going to change. The question is, how much? Because there's another group of people out there that are saying all men are created equal applies to me too. And that, of course, is women. They've been participating in this resistance and rebellion all the way since the early days, since the Stamp Act crisis. Women have been supporting it. Mercy Otis Warren, she's an important colonial woman in New England. She's married to James Otis, one of the first kind of colonial resistors to this to British policies, right? Going back to the Sugar Act. There are a lot of Americans saying, hey, wait a minute. A lot of American women saying, hey, wait a minute, the British government is going too far. They are politically oppressing us, and they're going to do their part. They're going to participate in these boycotts. They're going to help organize these boycotts. When the war comes, they're going to help run their husbands' businesses. They're going to help run their family farms. They're going to help raise food, raise supplies for the troops. They're going to do everything they have to help pull this thing off. In a big way, women become a part of public life in the colonies. A huge change from the way things had been. Remember what happened to Anne Hutchinson when she tried to be a part of public life in Massachusetts Bay Colony in its early years. She gets shunned from their society. She gets exiled from that society. The question here during this thing called the American Revolution is, how far are things going to change? What role do women have in public life in these colonies, now the United States of America, right? And one of the ideas that quickly comes out of this is definitely women are going to have some kind of role because one of the chief responsibilities to women in human society is to have children, right? They're the only ones that can. And because of that responsibility, because of that onus, there's also another onus put on them, that because they're bearing the children, they also have to help primarily raise the children. They don't have to, but definitely that has always been the role that's been forced on women, whether they like it or not. Well, here during the colonial period and now in the new United States, there's this idea, if we're going to be a country that allows the George Hugheses of the world to have a political voice, the George Hugheses of the world need to be educated at least in some level. And who's your first teacher? Your mother is. So for women to teach their children to be good citizens, women are going to have some kind of education. They're going to need to learn to read and write. They're going to have to understand basic civics. So there is this idea that women have a role to play in this new country. It's called Republican motherhood, is what we call it as far as historical kind of understandings. I apologize for the phone going off here. Republican motherhood is this idea that women are going to raise the next generation of citizens that are going to run this country, right? That is their role. But that is a role that's being given to them by men like John Hancock, Sam Adams, and others. Women, of course, are thinking about something much different, much bigger. One woman in particular kind of articulates this during the beginnings of this thing called the American Revolution, and indeed the War for Independence. Her name is Abigail Adams. She's married to future President of the United States, John Adams. And in 1776, while John Adams is on this committee that's helping write this document called the Declaration of Independence, Abigail Adams writes a letter to her husband, kind of pointing out what needs to happen here. What's the next step, right? She knows what her husband's doing. She knows what he's been pushing for several years now, and that is independence, that this country be a true country, separate from Britain. She then writes a letter to her husband when he tells her, hey, we're drafting it. We're coming up with the ideas of why we should be a country. She tells her husband, look, while you're writing this document, I need you to remember the ladies. So our question here is, what does that curious line mean? It becomes the most famous line of this private correspondence between husband and wife that eventually gets publicized after both of their deaths. What does Abigail Adams mean when she writes to her husband and says she wants him to remember the ladies? Does she mean include the rights of women in the Declaration of Independence? Is she talking about get me some supplies that I asked you to get while you're there in Philadelphia? Is it about to support the traditional rights of women in the home? Or is it about women have helped oppose the British government and he should remember that? Well, there might be some of the D in this answer, but what she's really pushing for, if you read this letter closely, is that women should have rights just like men. That indeed, to Abigail Adams, it's again kind of hypocritical for white male colonists to be saying we're being oppressed by the British government, we don't have a voice, we can't do what we want to do because we have no political power. And Abigail Adams says, well, that's how we wives feel. We don't get to own the property, men get to decide what happens to the property, even if it's technically ours. We don't have a right to vote and pass laws. We have to let you do that for us. And she says that is just as unfair to women as what you say the British government is doing to us colonists. And she has a point, right? That is absolutely true. Women have been a public part of this resistance to British policy, and now they want to be recognized, right? They can see the all men are created equal part coming before Jefferson even writes it. And what women like Abigail Adams are saying is all men should mean all people. What is surprising, however, is John Adams' answer to his wife. And now it's important for you to understand the relationship. They're going to be married for more than 50 years. I think it's almost 60 years together. Theirs is actually a true love story. They are partners in all things. When John Adams is defending the British troops after the Boston Massacre, he actually reads all of his court speeches to his wife to get her opinion. She tells him to fix things. He fixes them. Theirs is a true partnership as well as a love story. They never cheat on each other. There's no ideas that there's nothing. I mean, they have problems like any marriage, but theirs is a true partnership, a loving relationship their entire lives. John Adams is devastated when Abigail Adams dies when he's about 90 years old. So what he responds to his wife's letter asking him to remember women have a place in this new country is kind of surprising. He says it is absurd, right? He basically laughs in her face. Now they're writing letters, so he can't look at her physically, but essentially he says it's crazy. What you want is ridiculous and is never going to happen. So why is John Adams, who respects his wife's opinion so much, who actually relies on her to run the family's business when he's not around, why is he saying it's absurd that a woman like Abigail be given political rights? Well, that's an important thing. Because when you get down to it, John Adams isn't really afraid of his wife having political rights. He's afraid of what it means if she gets those rights. He's afraid that it means everybody, all poor people, poor men like George Hughes. John Adams understands he's probably going to have to give political representation to people like George Hughes. But where does it stop from there? If George Hughes gets a right to vote and Abigail Adams gets a right to vote, who else is going to want rights to vote? Native Americans living in these colonies are going to want rights to vote. And then comes the big kicker. Free blacks and enslaved blacks will say, hey, wait a minute, what about us? If you give everybody the right to vote, if all men are created equal, then you really do have to say everybody's treated the same. So for people like John Adams, this is pretty scary. He's going to need to interpret all men are created equal to mean something different, just like Thomas Jefferson is going to have to create a fiction in his mind as to all men doesn't mean all men, it means certain groups of men. Because otherwise, it opens up a door to everybody. And people like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson feel only people that are invested in society, have property, have wealth, most importantly, have an education, should really be the ones calling the shots and running things. Women don't go to college and have professional careers, at least in a wide range, like people like John Adams do. Poor people like George Hughes aren't educated well enough, don't have enough of an interest in their community. They'll always just vote for whoever's going to take care of them. They won't be able to see the big picture. That's how somebody like John Adams would kind of explain this, right? Kind of try to pass this off as. So this is an important moment, right? Here in the very beginnings of this American Revolution, this war for independence, there are big ideas being thrown around. Now, the state of New Jersey will actually do what Abigail Adams is asking for. And they'll kind of see John Adams's point as well. What the state of New Jersey is going to do is they're going to say, look, if you're a woman who owns property, you legally own property, we can't see any reason why you shouldn't vote, just like any man that owns property. So for about 20, 30 years, some women in New Jersey are going to get the right to vote. But people like John Adams go absolutely berserk when New Jersey does this. They say, wait, you have to change that law right now. Change it back, undo it. Well, New Jersey says we can't really undo it. And then John Adams says, well, pass another law that says only those women that are affected by that law right now are the only ones that are ever going to get to vote. And that's what New Jersey does. Because people like John Adams, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson inundate New Jersey's state government and say, look, you're opening up a can of worms that none of us want to deal with. Because if we let women with property vote, then we have to let men without property vote. And then once we let men without property vote, we have to let everybody vote. And that's scary. We don't want that. So they forced New Jersey to roll back that idea of giving all property owners the right to vote. It shows the limits of this American Revolution. It is quite radical. No country has ever actually been able to win its independence from an empire. The United States is the first country to ever actually do it, right? But that's only part of the process here. Once we have a country, how's it going to be run? Who's in charge of it, and what are the rules it's going to operate under? That all has to be hashed out now. All of that has to be figured out one step at a time. But the Declaration of Independence, this thing that we say we're fighting for, right? The ideals that are behind this country is going to make that a big question and make it really hard to figure out, right? It is going to be very complex. That's why the American Revolution isn't over. There are people like Abigail Adams, there are people like George Hughes that are out there saying, hey, wait a minute, I should be included in all of this. And these answers aren't going, or these problems aren't going away anytime soon. The answers are difficult to come up with and put solutions in place. So there's a lot of work to be done in this new country. Now, for one group of people, however, this war is once again an unmitigated disaster. It's the same people that have seen disaster after disaster happen to them since Europeans first started arriving in the Western Hemisphere. And that, of course, is Native Americans. For them, there's really no winning here, right? While the British were in control of North America for those few short years after the 7 Years' War, it looked like maybe Native Americans were going to be able to kind of find a way forward here. That they were going to be, they've lost a lot of land east of the Mississippi or east of the Appalachian Mountains, but from the Mississippi to the Appalachians, Native Americans were pretty much in control of their own lands. But when this war starts, when the United States is created and a rebellion's begun, Native Americans are going to have to choose sides just like everybody else. For the most part, they're going to choose the British side because at least the British aren't trying to take as much land. Indeed, the British seem to be able to try to preserve some Native American land. But some Native tribes are going to say, well, no, we're going to fight with these patriots because if we help them win, maybe they'll leave us alone and let us keep our lands. In the end, that doesn't actually happen, right? In the end, most natives are going to support the British because of that proclamation of 1763 that divided the land between white colonists, European colonists, and Native Americans. And when the British lose this war, they lose too. Because when Britain gives up, when Britain says, all right, we want peace, we need to end this war, after all, we really need to focus on France, they're the problem, Britain's going to cede a lot of territory to its former colonies, to this new country, the United States. A lot of territory that is claimed, owned by Native Americans. So when Britain leaves, these Native Americans are going to be at the mercy of this new country. And what we're going to find is the United States is going to treat Native Americans much like these colonies did when they were part of the British Empire, as an enemy, as an obstacle that just needs to be pushed out of the way, that their lands need to be opened up to development and brought into this new economic model of the United States. So for Native Americans, there is nothing good here. While the war is on, they're fighting with each other based on local issues like always, and when the British lose, so do they. They're going to lose a lot of power, a lot of support, and they're going to have trouble hanging on to what they've got left, just like they have been from almost the very beginning when the English showed up in Jamestown in 1607. So when you get down to it, for Native Americans, there's nothing good here. Even though the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, that is never going to apply to Native Americans. They are seen as somehow outside of this new country, even though some of them are actually fighting to help create this new country. It is just not going to go well for them. But in the end, this thing called the United States is going to be created. In 1781, after the disaster of Yorktown, the British start reaching out to the French and their allies, the United States, and tries to encourage a peace negotiation. In the city of Paris, these three groups sit down at the table and start hashing things out. Now, because Britain and France are still technically at war, technically so are the United States and Britain, the British reach out to the Americans secretly and say, look, if you'll sign a peace treaty with us exclusively right now, we'll give you a lot of land, essentially double the size of your country. The colonies are in this area called in the beige color on the left hand or on the right hand side of the map. But the British say, we'll honor some of your old charters all the way up to the Mississippi River. After the Mississippi, that's part of the Spanish Empire. We have no control over that. But we'll give you all that land up to the Mississippi River for your states to decide what to do with. The reason for this is the British want to bring a lot of pressure on France to end the war now, while the British haven't really lost anything other than the American colonies. By giving this secret deal to the Americans, if the Americans will sign this treaty and drop out of the war, gaining their independence, that means France now has to fight Britain by itself with Spain, and that war never goes well for the French. So the Americans take this offer. Even though technically we're allies with France, we go ahead and sign a secret peace deal with the British without France's knowledge. So in the end, we're not the greatest allies in the world, right? We needed France's money, we needed France's military to help win our independence. And when it came time to negotiate a deal, instead of working with France and a deal that works best for France and the United States, we take the deal that's best for us. Now, it's a great deal. That's why the British are being so generous. And if you're the negotiators for the United States, John Adams and Ben Franklin and Roger Sherman and others, you kind of have to take the deal. It's so generous you can't say no because you may never get anything this good again. So you can't really fault our negotiators for doing what they did. But if you're France, you feel kind of backstabbed here, and rightfully so, right? The Americans did not live up to the alliance that you have with them. And in the end, after the United States signs this treaty with Britain, if you are France, you want to sign a deal as quickly as possible too. This war is bankrupting you, as I've mentioned several times. You've gotten nothing out of this war so far. You haven't gained any of Britain's colonies. This war has just been about hurting Britain, and in hurting Britain, you've actually been hurting yourself. So there's a lot of pressure on France to sign a peace treaty of their own right after this one. And by 1783, the world is relatively at peace. But we can see the seeds of future conflict. France is in turmoil. People coming home, military coming home from this war, are bringing these ideas of liberty, of equality, of the ability of people to determine for themselves their political future, to have a voice in their politics. That has never existed in France, ever. And now they're talking about it. They're talking about changing their political system from a monarchy to something else. Now, of course, the king is not interested in this. They see themselves as all-powerful, the divine right to rule however they want to. But that is now in question in places like France. Other parts, especially in the Caribbean, a lot of slaves are looking around saying, hey, wait, if they can do it, right? Those people in those colonies can do it. Maybe we can do it here on our island. So the world is not going to return to stability anytime soon here. There is a lot more to be done here. And again, just because this country is now officially created, just because the war for independence is over, this thing called the American Revolution is still going to go forward. People like George Hughes want to be included in things. These new states are going to have to write laws that decide how are we running our states, how are we running this country, how are we running everything, including our societies and economies. So lots of questions to be answered here, right? Is this thing going to work? Again, no country's ever successfully broken away from an empire before and remained independent. Usually they get gobbled up by somebody else. So is it going to survive? Are we going to actually start incorporating more people? Do free blacks have a role in this country? Do poor whites men have a role in this country? Do women have a role politically in this country? All of that has to be figured out. And then, of course, if you're Britain, you kind of wonder, how did we get here, right? How did we lose such a big part of our empire so quickly? And what we kind of have to understand is the two things that matter most in this war actually have the less to do with the Americans, right? It is about British failures, first of all. They just didn't do their job the way they needed to. And then, of course, it's the help of France. It was critical. Without it, we probably still would have lost. So when you get down to it, it is more about British not doing their job than Americans somehow having a magic formula for success, right? But they are an inspiration now, these Americans, right? These crazy Americans have shown that it is possible to do this. Others are going to pick up that cry. Actually, for the next 200 years, the words of the Declaration of Independence are going to pop up over and over and over again. So this thing is not done by any stretch of the imagination. But one last kind of critical element here to kind of remember. This war for independence, this thing called the American Revolution, hasn't created one united country. It's actually created 13 new countries. Instead of thinking of yourself as British now, you think of yourself as a Virginian or a Georgian or a Massachusetts man or a New Yorker. You're still not an American, right? What it means to be an American hasn't really been established yet. What the United States hasn't been established yet. We have to create a national government. We have to really kind of coordinate things to make that happen. And right now, at the end of this war for independence, most of these states are not interested in that. They want to be left alone. New York wants to run New York. Massachusetts wants to run Massachusetts. Virginia wants to run Virginia. And that's about it. They don't want to have a lot of interaction with each other. But yet, they are an independent entity in total, right? All 13 of them together are this thing called the United States. So how united are they, and how are they going to run things between themselves and with the rest of the world? After all, they owe the world a lot of money, and they have a lot of interest to protect now. And now that they're no longer part of the British Empire, who are they going to trade with? How are they going to trade? They have a treaty with France that says they can trade with France, but France isn't going to be super excited with that after our attitudes with making a peace deal. And when you really get down to it, France doesn't need a lot of the things we have. They can get those things themselves. So big questions here to figure out. And that's where we'll kind of pick it up from next time, all right? So thank you very much for your time and patience. I know this is a long one, but we covered a lot of important information here, all right? So until then, I'll